A young father who's been to hell has to bury his wife and small children, and Israelis do everything in their power to show him he is not alone. The military investigations into the failure of October 7th, and we talk about the future of Gaza with someone who knows the enclave better than most. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland in London. It's Unholy, two Jews on the news with only half a voice between us. You can hear how awful I sound. I've picked up some kind of virus that's going around, but I want to say that maybe it's Unholy that's to blame because we've recorded not one, but two bonus episodes for our friends and our family listeners. And maybe that has pushed my voice too far, Yonit.
Yeah, first of all, don't blame the Jews for everything, Jonathan, all right?
It's the space laser that did it.
And second, we should say that our one of our bonus episodes is about Saturday Night Live celebrating its 50th anniversary, and it's the Jewish aspect of it, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I am. The voice is ailing, as you can hear. But it was great fun talking about SNL at 50. There is so much Jewish about that show. I think we both knew that we kind of had watched it over the years. We knew there was a lot of Jewish stuff. But once you take a deep dive into it, there is so much from the creator through to some of the big moments. So we chart all of that in that bonus episode. And look, if I could sacrifice my voice to record it, the least you can do is listen to it. Jewish Guilt Trip telling you to listen to the bonus episode.
Impressive.
That was impressive work. Guilt comes to us really worryingly naturally. So do go for our bonus episode. But lots obviously going on in the news this week.
So, I mean, there's so much going on here, and we probably should start with the military investigation into the failures of October 7th. It took almost a year and 5 months. And of course, Israel does not have a state's commission of inquiry because the prime minister and his government object to setting that up. So the only thing we do have is the military investigating itself. What we have seen so far in the last couple of days were the actual reports on what happened in every single kibbutz on the Gazan border. But today, what is coming out is more about I think I should call it under the headline, on blindness, which means basically what were the failures of the night before, 72 hours of the beginning of the attack on Israel, and also kind of looking back on the failures of intelligence. Now, once you see it all together, it is quite a shocking thing. Not only the numbers, like 5,600 terrorists breaking into Israel on that morning. And on the border, there are only 776 soldiers to answer this massive attack. But also what some of it we imagined, some of it we discerned. But obviously the fact that the intelligence did not look at Gaza and at Hamas, but anything other than a limited and very sort of mild kind of threat, where it should have seen the fact that it is indeed a huge threat. And there are so many parts, bits and pieces of this. I mean, for example, the probe into what happened in Kfar Aza, which is one of the kibbutzim on the border, the fact that there were soldiers, some of them, by the way, fought heroically, but some of them didn't even enter the kibbutz. The fact that at 8 p.m. on October 7th, this is more than 12 hours into the attack, there were still Israelis being kidnapped into Gaza. All of this information sort of amassed into giving us a very, tragic picture of what actually happened. And again, this is the military kind of answering itself and giving this report to the residents of the Gazan envelope. The big questions that go beyond the military and beyond these decisions obviously still need to be answered.
Just say something about the provenance of the report itself. Who was doing the investigating? What weren't they allowed to look at, if you like, that they would have done? If this was a state commission of inquiry, what sort of areas of ground would they have covered that they weren't able to cover in virtue of the fact that they were the military only rather than a full state commission? I mean, who was doing it? Just give us a little more. So
first of all, there are some of the, this is an internal investigation, meaning the people who are doing it, for example, in Kfar Aza, in that kibbutz, was someone who fought in Kfar Aza, something that the residents of this kibbutz were actually very upset about. They said, how can anyone who was in the mix of this would actually do this investigation? There were top officials going through these questions, but the actual answer to your question is that there is nothing that they looked at beyond the military and the military's decision on the night, on the days that followed, on the sort of what led us to this point, particularly in the realm of military intelligence. But there is more here, obviously, which is the government and its decisions and the people who ran the government and their decisions. This is not looked at by the internal investigation.
Yeah, and as you say at the start, that in a way is the key thing, because it was this concept, this strategic intelligence concept that Gaza posed no longer a threat, that in a way was the big mistake that was the mother of all the other mistakes. Because as we've talked about going back right to the time, those observational lookout soldiers who were seeing activity, but what they were seeing did not fit the preconceived concept of the decision makers at the top. And that was in a way because people don't see what they don't want to see. And Netanyahu and others had decided that Hamas was contained, it was deterred, it no longer posed a threat. And so no conflicting evidence would be seen. And that was all part of a strategy, a very deliberate strategy, which said, let's keep Hamas more or less there. Let's keep Fatah and Abbas in the West Bank. They'll remain forever divided. That way there'll be no prospect of a Palestinian state. And then all other conflicting evidence was sort of, reduced, suppressed, almost sublimated into that big finding. And of course, this probe was not going to look at that. But that is the mega question that will always, I think, hang over the events of October the 7th.
Yes. And in the meantime, when you look at or you try and compare this huge intelligence failure and terror attack to anything in the West, and you always kind of you throw yourself into the comparison of 9/11. Of course, numbers should be then changed into scale, because that would mean tens of thousands of Americans dead and 6,000 Americans abducted. But what I think is, and this went through my head yesterday, at the end of the day, 9/11 started and ended in one day on U.S. soil. I mean, there was the anthrax scare, and then there were two wars that were loosely connected to 9/11 or to what happened. But the essential terror attack started on that day and ended on that day. And for Israelis, what we feel, particularly this week, is that we are sort of in continuum waking up every morning and falling into a nightmare. And I think this week sort of encapsulates that very well. Even if the stories are, like we saw on Saturday, of hostages coming back alive, they embody the failure of this country to protect its citizens. And of course, what everyone was looking at this week was the Bibas family funeral, Shiri, Ariel, and Kfir. I'm trying to find comfort in this terrible tragedy, which is more than anything else, and firstly a tragedy of one family, but more than that of a nation mourning. And if you want to look for comfort, I think the one thing to look at is the thousands of Israelis lining the streets in solidarity and in unity to say goodbye to this family. And if you look beyond Israel, you see that this is somehow uniting the people with the conscience, who know where good is and where evil is. And when you see, for example, and Israelis do see this, right, the Empire State Building lighted in orange, representing Ariel and Kfir's orange hair, and you see that in Brandenburg Gate, and you see that in Eiffel Tower. You see that all over the world, and that kind of, I think, gives some comfort in these days, which were really just downright terrible. The funeral saw these heartbreaking moments where Yarden Bibas is saying to his wife, watch over me, make sure I don't slip into darkness. He says to his children, he begs for forgiveness for not protecting them. Of course, he is the last person who needs to beg for forgiveness. He himself was abducted into Gaza and held there for a year and 4 months. So coming out of hell only to enter another hell of saying goodbye to his family. The fact that all three of them were buried in the same coffin. I mean, even Ariel's best friend from kindergarten, Yoav, writing him a letter and saying to his mother, because his mother had to tell him he's not coming back. And he said to his mother, but I miss him. Can I just see him one more time? That kind of view of a child over this tragedy. When you go over, of course, Oded Lifshitz was also laid to rest this week. This man who, and we talked about it last time, dedicated his life to help Palestinians, to help others less fortunate than himself. And the fact that he was murdered the way he was and ended his life in that way. all of these stories feel like a tragedy folded into heartache, all wrapped in a horror story, because that is what they are. We should mention that 4 Israelis are being brought back. They were murdered by Hamas in captivity. We talked, I think, about some of them. It's Shlomo Mansour and Ohad Yahalomi and Itzik El-Garat and Tzachi Idan. I think we should say something about the Idan family and about Tzachi himself. He's from Nachal Oz. The terrorists broke into their home. They shot the eldest daughter, Ma'ayan, killed her, left her body, in fact, with the family. You see this was all streamed by Hamas. And then at some point they take Tzachi, they abduct him. He is covered in his daughter's blood. They hold him in Gaza eventually, from what Israel understands. They murder him. I mean, I'm sorry that these are the horror stories that I'm telling this week, but this is what Israelis are going through. And it is definitely a very difficult week with all of this wrapped in.
Ohad Yahalomi's sister, Effie, was one of those people I met when I was in the country a couple of weeks ago. Somebody who had just stopped everything she was doing. She'd given up her own business. She had effectively devoted herself to the return of her brother. And what has come back now is just the opportunity for a burial rather than for a reunion. And your point before about the drawn out nature of October 7th, I think is very, very important in terms of people outside understanding, for want of a better word, the Israeli kind of mindset these last 16 months, because it isn't, and it's become a cliche to say every day is October 7th and the day did not end then. What I think the meaning of that is that the hostage crisis has made it this long, drawn out, slow motion agony. And 9/11 wasn't like that. I think that's absolutely right. It was one horrific but sort of surgical blow almost, that it was over as soon as it had happened. But this has been this drawn out pain. And I think that has been, we've talked about it, but I think that has governed the Israeli sort of approach these last 18 months. It meant there's not room for anything else because it's still as if it's in that moment. And that governs everything else. I think, it's interesting to know whether even there was the bandwidth for Israelis to notice the investigation you mentioned, or whether the funerals and the farewells just crowd out everything else. I mean, there has been other news from Israel. I asked you about one story this week and you said, no one's got any attention for that at all. It's just all about the Bibes family this week. I wonder if even something like that investigation struggles to grab hold of the attention because people are still in that, the immediacy of Shiva and funerals and burials as if it were October the 8th, 9th, 10th or 11th.
Yeah, well, I think that the internal investigation does grab headlines. But yes, people are very much focused on the story of the hostages, particularly because officially the first phase of this deal is over, and now the second phase is supposed to happen, if indeed it will. That is the big question hovering over everything. Another thing that people will be talking about, we are sitting here on Thursday. We should say that tonight, Ilana Dayan, our friend of the pod, who will air an interview with Eli Sharabi, I remind you, who came back only very recently from Gaza. He was held in terrible conditions, starved by his captors. His wife and 2 daughters were murdered on October 7th. He tells about the tale. He says to Ilana, he talks about the fact he was tied down from the moment he was held till the moment he was released. He was always bound and tied. He talks about the situation there, what he went through. He's sort of shocked to discover that the hostage situation is a political issue in Israel. He says it's not left, it's not right. This is a straight line. I think he's doing this so soon after he's being released to say and to plead for more hostages to still be released. As I said, the second phase is supposed to begin, which is, of course, an entanglement at this point.
We'll obviously get into that in our interview with our guest this week. But a big part of this is the role of the United States. Obviously, it was the US that brokered the hostage deal. And the question becomes what pressure, if any, there will be from Donald Trump on Netanyahu to move to stage 2. The negotiations on that were meant to have happened already. They were meant to have started on day 16 after the deal was originally, set in train. That did not happen. They did not start talking about the second phase straight away. Obviously, the second phase is, on the one hand, crucial for Israel because it brings back the remaining hostages. On the other, it does require a full Israeli pullback out of Gaza. And that is unpalatable to parts of Netanyahu's coalition. And therefore, I think it's always been assumed he won't do it because he won't want to have to, detonate his own coalition. Donald Trump himself this week sort of said, up to you. I mean, he's not that invested in it. He has his own investments in Gaza, as it were. We'll come on to those. But what's your read of the domestic pressure on him to go to this next stage and bring the rest of them home? We'll ask our guests later whether or not even that is plausible if he wanted to do it, because obviously Hamas are a part of this. They're not neutral in all this. What's your read of Netanyahu's current mind as he goes into
Well, you have to look at the political schedule, which means that until he passes the budget, which has to happen any point until March 31st, he will be very concerned about the future of his coalition. You hear different voices with the ultra-Orthodox. Are they going to veto and be intransigent about this and say, first, you have to pass the draft bill, i.e. exempting an exemption to most of the ultra-Orthodox from military service. Only then will we support your budget. There is a difference between United Torah Judaism and Shas on this. Shas are with Netanyahu, United Torah Judaism a little bit less. We'll see how that, but I'm injecting politics into this to tell you that makes a difference for Netanyahu. If his coalition is stable, I think he has an easier path to try and pass this through. If not, that's a big question. He already has a kind of green light, as you mentioned, from Trump to say, whatever you decide. What Israel is trying to do now, and this is, always been our explanation about how Netanyahu works, it's kicking the can down the road, i.e. saying, let's just extend the first phase. Let's not talk about the second phase yet, but let's try and bring in more hostages, living hostages back, and we will give Palestinians more prisoners. But as long as we don't talk about the end of the war, a ceasefire, or the Philadelphia corridor, we'll try and bring back more hostages. Is this palatable for Hamas? That is a big question, but that is where the main focus of the Netanyahu government is at this point. There's obviously massive public pressure to bring back the hostages, whatever you want to call it, extending phase one, going into phase two, however you want to call it. There are still, Israel estimates, 22 or 24 hostages alive. Bring them back, and of course, bring those who aren't alive to be buried in Israel. That is a massive public pressure put on Netanyahu to the extent that he wants to listen to it.
In order to buy some time and, I suppose, space from the Americans, Netanyahu is doing whatever Donald Trump wants him to do. I was shocked to see Israel voting with the United States, which was itself a shock at the United Nations, alongside Belarus, North Korea, and Iran in supporting Russia against Ukraine. This was a resolution of the General Assembly that essentially said Russia was responsible for the invasion of Ukraine, whose third anniversary passed this week. To you and me, that would look like a statement of just an obvious fact. The United States now sides with Russia in saying, no, that didn't happen. And lining up, as I said, with North Korea and Belarus. And there alongside them was Israel. It didn't abstain. It actually voted with the Russians and with the club of dictatorships and would-be dictatorships to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, step away from the previous position, which we did talk about a lot at the time, of neutrality, of studied sort of distance that initially actually Naftali Bennett tried to maintain and then Netanyahu afterwards. But here, throwing its lot in with the dictators' club of Putin and now Trump, dispiriting, if you ask me, to side with an autocracy against a free country. But I suppose Netanyahu thinks that gives him more room from Trump. He stays in with Trump. He avoids another clash with Trump. And he probably needs that right now because, he wants a very long leash on these hostage negotiations. And also going on at the same time is a massive IDF operation in the West Bank, the biggest one for 25 years since the Second Intifada, some say bigger than then, in which Israel has operated inside 3 camps on the West Bank, Palestinian refugee camps, Tulkarem, Jenin and Tubas. It's just a point of departure where you think, if this was going on now, and Yisrael Katz, Israel's defense minister, saying up to 40,000 people have been evacuated from their homes in those places, and he says will not return. If this was Joe Biden and Tony Blinken, what would they be saying right now? I somehow think they would be at least saying something. But instead, the Trump White House is not going to give Israel any real grief about this, or any grief at all. And I suppose Netanyahu's vote at the UN is all part of just maintaining that. That's the quid pro quo. I'll, help you out with your vote for Putin, and in return, you'll let me do what I want to do, including in the West Bank. So we're seeing the reality, I think, of the new arrangement, the new configuration between Trump and Netanyahu playing out. But the area that will matter most, I'm sure, to Israelis is in terms of the deal we've been talking about and where that goes next.
Yeah, indeed. By the way, we should mention that in the military, I haven't heard the voices saying they won't be able to return. And what the sources inside the IDF are saying about that operation in the West Bank is to sort of move civilians out of harm's way. So you would want to wage a war against the terror infrastructure. But obviously, this is making a lot of headlines, again, outside Israel. I think inside Israel, as we said, what is quite concerning for Israelis is everything that has to do with Gaza and the power that Hamas still holds over that area and over its population.
That's interesting. If the IDF themselves are not saying it, because Katz absolutely is saying it, Israel's defense minister saying, quote, they will not be allowed to return. So he's explicit. But if the IDF are saying something different, then that's an interesting difference between the political echelon and the operational echelon. And maybe there's some hope in that daylight. We'll see. Again, these are all questions which we should perhaps put to our special guest this week. We've talked so much about Gaza in the last 16 months. It is much rarer to hear the view from somebody who is himself from Gaza, who has family there, and who's been watching these events with, a very, very direct stake in what's unfolding.
Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib is a Middle East political analyst who writes extensively about Gaza. He's vocally anti-Hamas. He is a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, a U.S. citizen from Gaza. He lost 33 members of his family in the war. Ahmed, we really appreciate you being on Unholy again. Thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
I think the first thing to ask you after President Trump's plan and his video gone viral around the world is, first of all, what do you make of that plan? And even what do you feel when you see that video that he sort of shared?
Well, the plan really isn't much of a plan in the sense that it's not really coherent about what the actual vision is, what the actual specifics of how, when, who will run Gaza, how will the U.S. own Gaza, how will the U.S. take over Gaza. Though at first he said we'll do whatever is necessary with regards to U.S. The presence of U.S. troops on the ground, and then he said Israel is going to hand it to us. So I'm just citing that as an example of the ever-changing nature of it being evidence that this really is not exactly well thought out. However, what this is, in my view, is an attempt, as many analysts have said, that the president wants to push the Overton window away from where we're at as far as what the reconstruction looks like, what Gaza's future looks like. I had a chance to hear Mr. Witkoff speak a couple of days ago. And, some of the points that he was talking about as to why Mr. Trump put forth this plan, sounded very reasonable to me as somebody who is very anti-Hamas and who wants to see Gaza prosper, who wants to make sure that this is Gaza's last war, notwithstanding the component about potentially having people leave with no pathway for them to return. But Gaza's been reconstructed 3 or 4 times already. This is not a good use of resources. On the other hand, I think the Arab countries are unfortunately reluctant to coming up with something that challenges the Palestinian Authority, challenges the status quo. The Arab countries, for the most part, and I'm not saying this as a diss on them, but they've been reluctant to even condemning Hamas, to even regularly and in unison and in a singular voice saying Hamas needs to step down. Hamas is finished. There is no future for the Palestinian people in Gaza with Hamas, and not just in Gaza, for the entirety of the Palestinian National Project. In the Arab world, of course, they're all saying this behind closed doors, and they all want Hamas to go, and they were counting on Israel to basically get rid of Hamas. But in the Arab world, if you don't publicly say this and openly and unequivocally, it's really meaningless. It counts for nothing. So far, based on all the chatter that I've picked up, based on all the indications that I have, amounts to nothing more than kicking the can down the road. Amounts to nothing more than a mere reconstruction of Gaza, which, don't get me wrong, I want Gaza reconstructed, but Gaza needs more than reconstruction. Gaza needs to be reconstituted. Gaza needs a renaissance and a rejuvenation beyond simply buildings. Like Gaza needs to break the cycle of aid dependency. I think now is the time to discuss those 2/3 of the population who consider themselves refugees. Are they really going to be permanently refugees in Gaza? Part of the ethos that's holding Gaza's development and Gaza's prosperity back is that many Gazans view themselves, and I want to caveat this by saying, I know that a lot of Israelis repeat this point, but I am a refugee from Gaza in the sense that my family had the UNRWA cards. I went to UNRWA schools. My dad, that UNRWA being the UN Refugee and Works Agency that's become quite controversial in recent months and the last year. My dad ran the UNRWA refugee clinic in Jabalia camp, which is in northern Gaza, which was decimated during the war. So I'm saying this as somebody who grew up with the UNRWA narrative and the right of return narrative, and having had a chance to step back a little bit. It's now is the time to say, we're the Arabs, the international community, we're renewing the covenant that we have with you, the people of Gaza, where we want there to be prosperity, but we want there to be, the appropriate deployment of resources for your rejuvenation and to regenerate Gaza. But Gaza cannot be a platform, the people of Gaza cannot be a people in waiting for some fantasy to return to mainland Israel. The people of Gaza belong here. This is your home. Though all of these details, all of these items that could have been, that now more than ever is the time to discuss. And what is can there really be a centralized Palestinian state where someone in Ramallah is going to rule over Gaza? I don't think that's ever going to happen. I think we should be talking about a federalist system where you have two entities, one in Gaza, one in the West Bank. This is using Gaza as catalyst, and that's not happening.
Let me just push you on this. Let me comment on this point about the people. I think the reason why Trump's proposal was so controversial wasn't because he was talking about redevelopment or beachfront property or anything. It was because he said, I want the people gone. I want them out to live somewhere else. It will be empty. And then I'm going to develop it with hotels and all that. So that's why people have been talking about ethnic cleansing and so on. And I'm interested to know, from your point of view and the family and friends whether, putting aside the shock there is at that idea even being entertained by an American president, whether you, from the people whether there are some, even many, who, despite the politics of it, would say, we are so ground down by 16 months of war and before that, round after round after round of destruction, that actually, if there was an opportunity to go somewhere else, Egypt, Jordan, Gulf states, somewhere else, that they would actually take it. And I think Trump, and sometimes we think he's just playing with us and he's not serious, other times he speaks as if he is serious and says, that's what they're going to go for. People will go for that. So just on making perhaps the mistake of taking him literally and seriously, do you think there would be Gazans, Palestinians in Gaza, who would actually take up this offer and leave if he means it?
And to be clear, like, I have addressed this very precise point, and I wrote about it in the Atlantic magazine, and I said there is no real estate solution for Gaza. And I've certainly distanced myself from any notion of even soft displacement that basically that does not conform to the wishes of the people. On the other hand, I have gradually basically changed my tune, and after talking to a lot of Palestinians in the Strip, after seeing the sentiment on the ground, I got out. My mom's out, my brother's wife is out, I got some children out, I got a bunch of other families that and helped a lot of other families get out of Gaza. Who am I to sit here in Washington, D.C. and pontificate about, like a lot of these people in the diaspora say, you need to stay there and hold the land and resist, and you are the only hope for a future prosperous Palestinian state. So I am absolutely a believer that those Palestinians in Gaza who are only human, who can only take so much, if they want to leave, we should absolutely allow them the opportunity to do so. We should absolutely open Gaza's, give them a pathway out. I don't believe in, the problem with this notion of it is a fact that a lot of people don't want to take in Palestinians. A lot of people, like Hamas and the Islamists and the jihadis and the terrorists, have sadly and regrettably and painfully, and it's so incredibly unfair, made the Palestinian people in Gaza very radioactive and very, very unsavory, which is unfair because we have a lot of brilliant minds in business and in academia and in just like in all sorts sectors of life. But Trump's plan, I don't like. I have heard different and what Mr. Witkoff said when I heard him speak, and I had a chance to just briefly chat with him afterwards. Like the plan is not for a mass eviction, and or the proposal, the vision is not for a mass eviction, but it is to account for the fact, and this is the part that I care about most. All indications right now point to the inevitability. The war is going to restart. Those shameful displays that Hamas did, Hamas basically sealed its fate at a time when some in the Arab world were willing to discuss potential integration, potential softening. Maybe we rehabilitate Hamas, maybe we recycle some of them, maybe we do this, maybe we do that. But to the Israelis, to the United States, and even to some like Hamas is completely unacceptable as a player in Gaza right now, particularly in general, but especially after those shameful displays that just showed how these people are irredeemable. Not the people of Gaza. I'm talking about the Hamas's leadership and fighters, and that there's no vision, and that there's also like the leadership abroad has no real teeth on the folks. For an example, like it was agreed that the release of the bodies of the Bibas family and Oded would happen without a ceremony, right? Without that shameful display, that it would just be kind of a discreet affair. And instead, Hamas and Gaza was like, well, screw that. Like we're gonna have our little affair, So like there is no path out unless Hamas in Gaza somehow, the second Sinwar that no one seems to want to talk about, and Mohammed Sinwar, unless those people decide that we are going to either demilitarize or turn over our weapons to an observer, or like we're going to do something else fundamentally different, there is no pathway forward except for the war. That breaks my heart. That is so devastating for the people in the Strip. And for me, I'm done. Like, I'm done holding back and thinking, okay, well, Egypt has 3 Berlin walls along the Rafah border crossing, and they have their own reasons for why they don't want to let Gazans out. Israel is never going to take Gazans in on its side of the border. Gaza is the only territory that overlooks the Mediterranean that doesn't have a functional seaport. Like, I am stopping at nothing to say if the war restarts, which it looks increasingly inevitable, and that there will not be, and some of that, by the way, is a function of the far right in Israel. This is like as a friend of mine, an Israeli friend of mine, who was a negotiator during Oslo and knows what he's talking about, said, this is a do or die for the far right in Israel, who really want to take over this strip, want to, sabotage the deal. They don't want.
And by the way, what you mean by this is also that the hostages, or the remaining hostages that are still alive, are gone if the war, resumes. So what is the end game? How do we disentangle ourselves from this war eventually, even if what we see now is the war resuming? How does this end in a way that makes sense?
What I was saying just earlier, just the final tidbit of the point, is that I care more about the lives of Palestinians than even any land or any territory. So I want to save, I think what Mr. Trump was dabbling with there, and so were like some of his aides and advisors, is it really rational to hold these people against their will in a war zone? Gaza is the only war zone in modern history where the people were forced to stay there against their will, while ferocious fighting is taking place everywhere else, like everywhere around them. You look at Mosul, Fallujah, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Kurdistan, Myanmar, Sudan, everywhere you want to look at, in Central Africa and the Sahel region. People are allowed to flee. Some eventually return, some are resettled, some are this and some of that. I know there's a sensitivity with the Nakba memory for the Palestinians and the forced displacement. But I'm saying this point has to be front and center for all who claim to care about Palestinians, for all who claim to be pro-Palestine. And then that leads neatly to your question, Yonit, is like, how do we disentangle? Well, I think there needs to be kind of, and not that may or may not lead to an immediate behavioral change, but I think there needs to be an immediate condemnation and a call out of Hamas. Hamas is the devil for the Palestinian people. And again, I'm speaking for the Palestinian people. The Israeli and Jewish communities, they have a lot of work to do on their side with the Israeli government, with Netanyahu, with what happens with the hostages. I am speaking as a Palestinian Arab Muslim. On our side, we need our community in the West Bank, in the Arab world, in Britain, in the diaspora, to in unison say, guys, we are still not out of the disaster. Like, a lot of pro-Palestine voices seem to have quieted down, as predictable. Like, as soon as the guns, fall silent, they go home. And then when the wars comes back around, they'll be like, oh, Israel is killing a bunch of children. Let's, genocide. So the ignorance is directly linked to how Hamas, you think Hamas is doing these parades in Gaza with the hostages? You think they're doing it for the people of Gaza? Absolutely not. Hamas is delegitimized. The people of Gaza loathe the movement. If you are in a dirty, disgusting line waiting to use a bathroom with 500 other people, if your home is gone, if your child is sick, if you're out of money, if you haven't earned anything, if you have skin problems, if you're in a wet tent, you're not standing there and saying like, wow, Hamas is wonderful. October 7th, this is a favor. But Hamas very much so cares about its image to the outside world and is driven by the perception that, well, our people might be in disarray. The Palestinian national project is practically finished. There's no Palestinian state, but we have a bunch of people in the diaspora loving us. We have a bunch of, we brought the Palestinian issue back to the forefront. This is literally a Hamas talking point in Arabic. You go on all their Telegram channels. So the disentanglement, as much as it is political, it is narrative and action based, as far as like the people of conscience recognizing the disaster. As for this, the political track, I think there needs to be a recognition that no Arab plan will ever succeed. And that needs to be, like, there needs to be transparency about what are we going to do about security, guys? Like, how are we going to make sure that the Gulf doesn't just like pump in $20 billion only for Hamas to essentially waste it again? Like there hasn't been transparency about the security component. We know the Arabs don't want to send in a military force to confront Hamas. We know the Palestinian Authority isn't really capable of facing Hamas. So, like, to me, that's where the leadership of the United States and the U.S. is not leading. The U.S. right now is literally stepping back and saying, okay, well, we're just waiting for what the Arabs come up with, and we're just waiting for what the Arabs present. And I don't think that's a position of leadership. I think that is purely reactive. Mr. Trump kind of ruffled all the feathers and just did all of this with his proposal. But instead of actually helping shape the frameworks, he's kind of backtracked from a lot of it and just said, okay, well, I'm getting the Arabs to now come up with a plan. And the Arabs are like, okay, well, let's just reconstruct Gaza and leave the people there, and we don't care about anything else.
Ahmed, let's talk about how it's possible to translate the popular disapproval there is for Hamas, which you've described, how that translates into action to push Hamas out. How does that happen?
I mean, I think there's a disconnect, and this has been my kind of like one of my central, like my thesis, my raison d'etre, if you will, since October 7, is to kind of expose this massive disconnect. And I don't care all these polls, and like we can talk about them separately. In my view, in the Gaza Strip, all of this polling is garbage, utter nonsense, irrelevant trash in a unfree, undemocratic society run by Hamas. I don't care what PhDs, how much many. I know people who have spent tens of thousands of dollars to do polling in Gaza. Like, give me a break. And the IDF itself found documents that say, Hamas exaggerated those poll results. Like, even at a time when the IDF itself has incentive, you would think, to let the results kind of stand and say, oh, look, Gazans all support Hamas. They all support October 7th. And there are some polls that actually do show the discontent, but I don't care about polling. I care about the masses of people. And I'm sorry, I challenge even plug it into an AI. At any of these shameful displays that Hamas puts on, you will never find more than 1,000 civilians, at most, at these ceremonies. But my raison d'etre, going back.
Who are coming because they're forced, or coming because they want
Hamas,
to come?
Of course, Hamas have family members. They have mothers, like those old ladies that were spraying flowers on them. Like those fighters, those terrorists, like they have mothers, they have sisters, they have brothers. But also people are bored. There is nothing. And they do these. Like I was reading this story, and I obviously in Arabic, my native tongue. People are like, oh, we saw these bulldozers. They came and they were clearing this massive area. And we were like, thank God, they're going to put some of these new caravans. They're going to put new tents for us. Hallelujah. Praise be to Allah. And then it was like they cleared the area and they used these bulldozers that are there to remove the rubble, to create space for their stupid stages, to do these shameful hostage releases. And people were like, what? Really? This is how you're using the gasoline that is coming in small quantities, is to create stages for so I've read in some places that some people were getting parcels of food. Some people were getting like 100 shekels. There is a very, very deliberate, and I've never seen such a despicable display, a very deliberate corralling of all the young children and getting them to chant in unison. And I would challenge someone with basic media expertise and literacy, study all the footage, and you will find regularly a bunch of children and one mass terrorist, and he's telling the children what to say and like all these anti-Semitic slogans. So going back to I'm sorry, I just got distracted. The main point is
I distracted you, but Jonathan's question, how do you translate this into kicking Hamas out?
The main point is there's a disconnect between how Palestinians in Gaza feel towards Hamas, not just because of the consequences of October 7th, but ideologically because of the repetition. They've lived through it, because of the crap of Hamas, because of the squandered opportunity, because Hamas made them all dependent on the NGO industrial complex, because of the squandering of the resources. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the withdrawal from Gaza in 2005. Tens of billions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives squandered for absolutely nothing. And the Strip sits in ruins. The Palestinian National Project is in shambles. People in Gaza are not stupid, all right? They register that. So the attitudes in Gaza versus the attitudes abroad, including in the West Bank. And the West Bank is its own separate monster. The attitudes abroad, which in the aftermath of October 7th, something that I honestly ascribe to, something akin to like a mass psychosis event, whereby Hamas was normalized and tolerated and accepted in ways that I had never seen before. And I used to be, in like 10 years ago, involved in the I used to put the keffiyeh on and genocide this, genocide that. And I was wearing the flag until I realized this is a completely problematic movement. And I sort of moved in a different direction. But that, unfortunately, is part of the disaster. Hamas looked at that when there were college student encampments in the United States, and I went to the heart of UCLA, and I did a little tweet that went mega viral of the encampments there. I had people from Gaza who were faceless, who I am 1,000% confident were Hamas militants and Hamas kind of lieutenant type personalities. And I have the messages and I have it saved, who were just messaging me in anger and rage, like, how dare you? These people are courageous. Don't talk bad about college students. And then you have all these clips of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders saying that we love these student encampments. We love this. We love that. So that is the nut that I'm trying to crack and unfortunately, some of those people who are pro-Palestine in the diaspora, for them, this is how they show legitimacy. This is how they show that, some genuinely are against Hamas, but they're like, wait. So, and I've talked to a few of them. They're like, unfortunately, when I put something out against Hamas, then the Zionists and the pro-Israel Jews flock to me and they want to share my message and then I feel tokenized and then I don't want to be seen in their company. And what I say to them is like, oh my God, dude, that's like you rushing to Haaretz because Gideon Levy posts all these articles that are critical of Israel. Of course, both communities are looking for somebody from the other side to validate their thoughts or narrative, or to at least be like, oh, this is an interesting perspective. So what I've been saying is there's nothing wrong with having a tactical alliance with Zionists, with Israelis, with Jews, with Orthodox folks, Reformed Jews, whatever community of your choice around the issue of Hamas is bad for Israelis and Palestinians alike. And so to me, I have grown to appreciate the inseparability between the narrative component around Hamas and how that is basically upstream from policy making. And how that is basically, and mind you, in the Arab world, and I talk to Arab diplomats and very senior Arab diplomats, and behind the scenes, again, it's like, yes, they're like me. They're like, oh, Hamas is Hamas, blah, 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 blah. But they're like, we're managing very complex societies with very hostile populations that have been fed Al Jazeera. But also, I mean, let's be clear, like Israel has absolutely committed heinous acts throughout this war and horrendous atrocities. I don't care about all the talk about the precision and this is targeted and oh my God, no, we did this, we do that. Like, that is a fact of war in general, but is also specific to, call it poor intelligence, call it sloppiness, call it lack of discipline. And we can spend a whole lot of time talking about how, because it's a reserve army, how because of the kind of the breakdown of like the command up top gives these orders, but by the time they make it down to the sergeants and the field commanders, there's a lot like people go from civilians to reservists. So reservists go from civilians to soldiers. And many of these soldiers who are reservists, they have ideological inclinations. They're not part of a professional army. They all have their cell phones and TikTok. And we saw what was happening with playing with Palestinian women's underwear, whatever. Like all of these things add further fuel to the genocide narrative, to the idea that Israel is just this inherently, irredeemable entity. And so by all means necessary, and I don't care how evil Hamas is, Israel is 50 times worse. To which I will then say, you cannot talk about the Israeli problems and crimes and occupation without, you cannot separate that from Hamas. Those are inseparable. So that's where the Arab world, unfortunately, with its diplomacy, with its media, have failed to counter Al Jazeera, have failed to counter Iranian and Russian-sponsored propaganda, have failed to counter to work with their people like that. Let's be honest here. Let's be very frank. A lot of the Arab world, the Muslim Brotherhood is banned. Hamas is banned, opposition is banned. So somehow there's an ability to exercise this authoritarianism, but there hasn't been an ability to kind of extend that to a compelling pro-Palestine narrative that separates us from Hamas. So that's what I've been trying to do. In the Western world, I think it's 50 times worse. I actually genuinely think the radicalization in the Western world is a lot more sinister, because you can in the Arab world, it is still difficult to speak out in some places. It is still difficult to break away from, there's the confluence of culture, religion, the nature of the societies. Here we actually have freedom of speech. Here we actually have the ability to make informed decisions. Here we actually, as diaspora Palestinians, have a choice to be helpful to our brethren in Gaza and to separate our people's just and urgent aspirations from Hamas. And so I keep coming back to that because, again, that is literally like 50% of my work is narrative. The other 50% is to try to have that rejuvenated narrative inform policymaking.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if we're more optimistic talking to you, but we definitely know how to define the problem better. I think.
May I on that just briefly?
Sure.
Don't for a second think that I got to DC 6 months ago. I didn't get here and pick up and I mean, I had a good, comfortable life working in international development in the global South and in global health and poverty alleviation. It was a very fulfilling career. I was like doing really well and my health was even better. Like I didn't pack up my life in California and come out here because I wasn't optimistic. I very, very much so believe that there are multiple threads of opportunities to be used and explored and exploited. I mean, I think, unfortunately, sometimes it takes something this horrendous to potentially push for a different pathway forward. So don't for a second think that there's no optimism about, and I remain very optimistic in the medium and long term about the prospect of Gaza's rejuvenation and the prospect, this to me is the bigger picture, Gaza's integration with the Arab world, Gaza's integration with kind of like Gaza being a part of the broader free, like regional, like the Abraham Accords, in the sense of like the region is being reformulated. The narrative, the Palestinian narrative, is something that I care about. And for me, I want to start with Gaza. I want to focus on Gaza and use that as an effective role model for what a effective Palestinian nationhood and statehood could look like. I think Gaza is solvable. I think Gaza is addressable. That is not the issue that should keep us up at night. The issue is, what do you do when there is no pathway to Palestinian statehood? What do you do when you have the annexation of the West Bank, or, as a lot of my right-leaning Israeli counterparts will insist on calling it Judea and Samaria, and that's just, there's no discussion. Khalas, we're done. Like, they believe that the integration of the West Bank and application of Israeli sovereignty is going to force the Palestinians to wake up and realize that there's no pathway forward except peace. I think the complete opposite. But that's where, for me, I am willing to separate Gaza from the West Bank. And I actually want Gaza to be separated from the West Bank, because our people have suffered enough. Gaza can no longer be a platform to correct whatever is happening in Jerusalem. Like, that's what Hamas would do anytime it wants to launch an attack, is slap the name Aqsa in Jerusalem onto any of its failed adventurism and terror attacks. We're doing this not for us, it's for Aqsa, it's for Jerusalem. And I want to sever that. I want to cut that off. Gaza is a Palestinian autonomous region that is the jewel of the Palestinian people, that has an airfield and a seaport, and I'm working on proposals for that, that has a gas field, that overlooks the Mediterranean. Gaza is the only territory that overlooks the Mediterranean that has no functional seaport. Did you know that?
Well, we're not going to. Well, this is for our next conversation. Of course, Netanyahu was willing to give Gaza that seaport before October 7th.
But we could have had it in going back like 20 years plus as part of Oslo. But this is what I mean is I want to rejuvenate Gaza, focus on Gaza. And this is not Hasbara. This is not, Israeli propaganda. This is reality. This is truth, that by the next battle, and I hate those phrasing, but this is what I say to Palestinians in Gaza in Arabic. I say the next battle, I say we need to get rid of guns. We need to take those guns and AKs and literally twist them in our own hand. The next battle is one of construction, one of scientific advancement, one of AI, one of stability, one of who are we as a people? What represents the Palestinian national movement beyond the kafiyah and the flag? Is it just the kafiyah, the flag, the AK? Is it Zatar? Is it the food? Is it our ingenuity? I mean, the Arabs, and my dad was a part of it. My dad went to western Saudi Arabia in the, late 70s, early 80s, when the stereotypes were true. He didn't have running electricity for 8 years. They didn't have water, and now Saudi's this amazing place that's up and coming. Palestinians helped build the Arab world. That is not an exaggeration. Palestinians have the lowest illiteracy rates in the entirety of the Arab and Arab world. And yet somehow, when it comes to nation building, everything is Israel's fault. And everything is, we are perpetual victims, and if only Israel would just step back. And I want us to be defined by what we're for, not what we're against. And that's my hope. And that's what is making me optimistic. That is what keeps me going amidst the never-ending sea of misery, suffering, division. And I'll also share with you that the number of Jewish and Israeli and Zionist folks, the tens of thousands of them, that on a regular basis are reaching out to me and saying, you've helped me single-handedly believe that the Palestinian people, humanize the Palestinian people. And I know that sounds we should take it for granted, but after October 7th, after all that Hamas is doing, unfortunately, Hamas made it easier for our people to be dehumanized. So I believe there is, and the number of Arabs and Muslims and Palestinians who privately reach out to me and say, thank God someone else is saying what we know is true, but we can't say so publicly. Or I have a family, or my family is crazy, or my community is crazy. So there's a lot to be optimistic about.
That's a good point to end at. Ahmed Fouad Al-Khatib, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
I mean, the one thing I'm thinking while listening to Ahmed is that if there were more voices, clear voices like him, we would be in a different place, I think. And as he says, I'm getting a lot of people, both from Gaza and from other Arab states, telling me that I'm right, but they're not saying it out loud. And I think that is part of the problem, to be quite honest.
Yeah, when we had him on the first time, I think that was one of our questions to him, which was, to what extent are you a lone voice? And he says, and I've spoken to him about this since, he says privately people say to him all the time, we're with you, but they are reluctant to go public. He's very alert to the danger of that the pro-Israel groups or Jewish groups in America and elsewhere will be so pleased to hear a Palestinian from Gaza criticizing Hamas that they will seize on him as the Palestinian they want to listen to. And he said, I thought very interestingly, it is the equivalent in reverse of the sort of Gideon Levy syndrome, in which, the very left of center Haaretz columnist is often feted by pro-Palestinian groups as the one Israeli they want to listen to. That is a danger for someone like Ahmed too, that he becomes the Palestinian that people can, bear to listen to. He's alive to that danger. But I think he does make these very forceful points that on the ground, in the community that he is part of and from, his father was there in Jabalia running a program there. This is his, the community he comes from. He insists, many, many people who are furious and livid about Hamas. I mean, how amazing that story of the bulldozers, that people were excited. They saw the bulldozers clearing rubble. They thought, good, at last they're about to house us. And instead it was to create the stage for what he described as these disgraceful, shameful, theatrical performances, the hostage handover ceremony. So I find him always worth listening to and always interesting. And as he says himself, there's that question about who else is behind him when he makes these points.
He said Hamas essentially sealed its fate with these grotesque ceremonies. Grotesque is my word. I think he said other adjectives, but the point is that he says the war will resume after this. This means a lot on the Israeli side and on the Palestinian side. But he also sort of did carve or at least talk about his optimism about what the way forward could look like. And again, as I said, I think for Israelis, if there were more voices like his, it would be an easier path forward. We have our awards to give out, sir. First of all, Mensch Award to Jonathan Friedland for holding up this episode, being as sick as he is.
I appreciate that.
So I feel
our audience deserve a Mensch Award for listening to this appalling excuse of a voice and coming this far. So well done if you've made it till now. I thought a Chutzpah nomination would go to the LSE, the London School of Economics, for a rather striking event, which has caused, and got a lot of attention, a book launch event. The book is called Understanding Hamas and Why That Matters. But the promotional material for this book, written by a group of, authors, says across Western mainstream discourse, the Palestinian resistance movement Hamas has been subjected to intense vilification, branding it as, in quotes, terrorist or worse. This demonization intensified after the events in southern Israel on October the 7th, 2023. Now, your long-time unholy listeners will be turning to their dictionaries for the definition of demonized. I don't think you really call it demonized when a group has committed murder of 1,200 civilians and all the crimes that went with that. You don't need to demonize. You don't need to turn into a demon people who do that. It seems they have done that and a pretty good job of it all by themselves. That is not the meaning of the word demonized. Demonized is when you take something that is actually quite ordinary and turn it into a demon. You don't have to demonize a huge act of mass murder and slaughter as on October 7th. And notice how the press release doesn't bring itself to say what actually happened on October 7th, but instead talks about the events in southern Israel being very euphemistic. And George Orwell taught us that when people turn to euphemism, there's always a reason. There's something they want to hide. So I think the promotional material for this event at the LSE gets a Chutzpah nomination from us.
Yeah, I mean, this comes out of this very same week Israel is burying the Bibas family and Oded Lifshitz. We should remind our listeners that they were supposed to return with no ceremony. We heard Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib talk about this, to say nothing of the way they were kidnapped, the way they were murdered, and the way that Shiri Bibas's body was returned. I mean, at the beginning, it wasn't her. All of this and what the LSE's invite to the event says, branding it, Hamas has been demonized. I mean, this is, as you say, you don't need to work hard at demonizing Hamas. Should we go to our Mensch?
We should. Yeah, I mean, it's institutions losing their usual rigor, I think. The LSE knows that you don't demonize already demonic behavior, and they, should have just applied their usual high scholarly standards, and they wouldn't have got themselves into this mix. While we're on that, just a passing mention of the BBC and the controversy they've got into about a Gaza documentary, which they've ended up pulling from their catch-up service, the iPlayer, because that documentary of telling the story of Hamas that documentary telling the story of the Gaza war from the point of view of children on the ground, which is a worthwhile and necessary thing to do, by the way, but choosing as one of the child narrators and not revealing to their audience that one of those narrators is the son of a Hamas official, in fact, a former deputy minister in the Hamas administration. Now, either the filmmakers didn't know that, massive journalistic failure, or they did know it and knew that if they shared that with the audience would think less of their film. Either way, it's a failure of editorial rigor and practices. And sure enough, the documentary's been pulled, and there are people, various eminences, calling for it to be restored, as if it's about now whether you sympathize with Palestinian children or not. It's not. It's about journalistic rigor and standards. And it is not journalistically up to standard to present somebody without giving the full context of who that person is. And if you know it and withhold it, then you're not in the journalism business, you're doing something else. So, I think there's a pattern here, which is big institutions falling down when it comes to this subject because they're not, applying their usual standards. That's all you have to do.
Yeah, after saying all this, all things considered, maybe an asteroid hitting Earth is not the worst possible outcome. Just saying. Okay, that might make you solve your health problems this week. I'm just saying.
Have a stroke. Okay. That would be a good solution.
No. Anyway, this is our Mensch Award for the week. We said besides the Mensch Award, apart from the Mensch Award for Jonathan, we shall give it to, I was going to say Timothy Chalamet, but actually it's to his mother. And should we be accurate, his Jewish mother, who, after he won an award, he's portraying Bob Dylan, and I think he received the SAG award. And this is what she said to him. She said, this is such a Jewish mother thing to say. Her response was, "Don't forget to fold your laundry." I think that's awesome.
It's good advice.
Jewish mothers bringing us down to earth.
It's good advice anyway, but yes, exactly that. That's what it is, isn't it? It's don't get too big for your boots and keep it real and all those things. Of course, she might have turned to the reporter and said, "But you know what his brother does?"
I can only quote my beloved Jewish mother, Naomi, who says to me each time she listens to this podcast, "You do it so well, better than you anchor the news." So
that's
her
a
equivalent.
Media version
that is
of the red tie, blue tie, isn't it? That's really harsh. That's very tough, Mrs. Levy, on your daughter. Be sympathetic. But that is the red tie, blue tie. Do we need to explain that gag for our audience? Do people know?
I think I don't know if for the non-Jewish part of our audience, perhaps we should.
The joke is that the Jewish mother buys her son 2 ties, red tie and a blue tie, and sees him again, a week after the birthday, and he's wearing the blue tie. And she goes, "So what was wrong with the red tie?" You know.
Yep.
That's Timothée Chalamet's mother winning her Mensch award.
For the first time in this show, but perhaps not for the last time. I think I see real potential in her.
Yeah, I think she's going to have a lot more practice with this because he's going to win a whole lot more awards, isn't he? He's a proper star. Now that I've seen the Dylan film, we're going to talk about that, I think, on a future episode. Much to say about him, about the Bobster, but I'm not going to say it because I'm going to rest my voice.
You should. And we will say our thank yous to Michal Porat. And thank you again for joining in, Johnny, although you feel, terrible. But we'll be better by next week. And we shall see each other soon.
We will.